My friends think you're not remarkable enough for me. I could do better. Daniel said it with a small laugh, swirling his glass like he was talking about wine, not his wife, and for a second I thought I misheard him, but then his friend Tyler leaned back in his chair and smirked. He's got a point, man. You could do way better. And someone else chuckled under their breath while I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth, feeling the heat crawl up my neck. The soft clink of silverware suddenly louder than anything else in the room. Camila, don't take it personally, Daniel added, not even looking at me. They're just being honest, and that was the moment something inside me went very, very still. I set my fork down carefully, wiped my hands on the napkin, and said, "Then go find better." My voice calm, steady, almost gentle, and the table went quiet for half a second before someone laughed again like it was all a joke, like I didn't mean it, but I did. I meant every word. I just didn't show it. Because I had learned a long time ago that silence carries more weight than anger. If this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you. Take a moment to like and subscribe, and maybe tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. Because I always wonder who's out there listening to stories like mine in the middle of their own nights. My name is Camila Reyes. I'm 32 years old, and that dinner was the night everything in my marriage finally broke. But the truth is, it didn't start there. It started long before anyone at that table realized what they were watching. Earlier that evening, I had spent 2 hours getting ready in our small bathroom, the one with the flickering light above the mirror that Daniel kept promising to fix but never did. I wore a simple black dress, nothing flashy, just clean and fitted, something I knew wouldn't embarrass him, because that's what I had been trying to avoid for years, embarrassing him. "Is that what you're wearing?" he asked from the doorway, already dressed in a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to look effortless. "It's fine," I said. Adjusting the strap. "Fine," he repeated, like the word itself disappointed him. "Just don't, try too hard tonight." I looked at him in the mirror. "Try too hard at what?" He shrugged, checking his watch. "At talking, at explaining your work. Just keep it light. Let me handle the conversations." I nodded, because that's what I always did. I nodded and made myself smaller, made myself quieter, easier to manage. At the restaurant, a place he picked because his friends liked it, dim lighting, polished wood tables, a menu where nothing had prices printed on it. His friends were already there, laughing, loud, confident, the kind of people who filled space without thinking about it. "Camila," Tyler said when we sat down. "Still doing that consulting thing?" He dragged the word out like it didn't mean much. "Yeah," I said. "Something like that?" "She works from home," Daniel added quickly like he needed to clarify. "Keeps things flexible." I felt my fingers tighten around the glass of water in front of me. Flexible, that's what he called it. Like it wasn't real, like it wasn't serious, like it didn't matter. "Must be nice," one of the women said, smiling politely, not having too much pressure. I smiled back. "Yeah," I said, "something like that." The conversation moved on without me. Investments, promotions, new apartments, numbers being thrown around like they defined who mattered and who didn't. I listened, nodded at the right moments, laughed when expected, just like always, until Daniel said it. That one sentence that sliced through everything I had been holding together. "My friends think you're not remarkable enough for me. I could do better." And suddenly every small moment from the past few years lined up perfectly in my mind. Every time he corrected how I spoke at events, every time he interrupted me mid-sentence, every time his mother asked me, "So when are you going to do something real with your life?" While I sat there with a degree, a business, a bank account he had never once asked about. "You're quiet tonight," Daniel said later when we got home, tossing his keys onto the counter. "Just tired," I replied, slipping off my heels. "Don't be like that," he sighed. "It was just a joke." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and realized something that felt heavier than anger. He actually believed it. He believed I was someone he had outgrown, someone temporary, someone less. "I'm not being anything," I said softly. "I'm just listening." He shook his head like I was the problem, like I always was, and walked past me toward the bedroom, already scrolling through his phone, already somewhere else. That night, while he slept, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, the screen casting a pale light across the room, my inbox filled with messages he had never seen, contracts he had never asked about, numbers he had never imagined. I hovered over one email, in particular, my finger resting on the trackpad, the subject line simple, direct, final. I didn't click it yet, not then. Instead, I closed the laptop slowly and sat there in the quiet, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside, and something else, something deeper. The realization that the man sleeping in the next room had no idea who I really was, and the truth he was about to learn was something he would never be able to take back. I grew up in a house where being quiet was the easiest way to stay safe, not from anything loud or obvious, but from the kind of disappointment that settled into the air and never really left, the kind you could feel even when no one said a word. My mother used to line us up before family dinners, smoothing my younger sister Elena's hair with careful hands while barely glancing at mine. "Stand up straight," she would tell her, adjusting her dress. People notice these things, and then she would turn to me and say, "Just do not say anything strange tonight, Camila," like my words were something unpredictable, something that needed to be managed. I remember one night when I was maybe 9 years old, sitting at the edge of our dining table, my legs not quite touching the floor, watching Elena show off a drawing she made at school. Bright colors, a sun too big for the page. "This is beautiful," my mother said, her voice soft in a way I rarely heard. "You are so talented," my father nodded, smiling. "That is my girl." And I held my own paper under the table, folded in half, something I had spent hours on. Careful lines, careful shading, waiting for the right moment to show it. But the moment never came. "Camila, pass the bread," my father said instead, not looking at me, and I slid the basket across the table, my drawing still hidden in my lap. "Did you finish your homework?" my mother asked without meeting my eyes. "Yes," I said. "All of it." "Good," she replied, already turning back to Elena. "Make sure you help your sister if she needs it." It was always like that, not cruel, not harsh, just uneven. Like I existed slightly to the side of everything important. "You are the responsible one," my mother would say whenever Elena forgot something or made a mistake. "You know better." And I did. I learned early that being reliable meant being invisible, that doing everything right did not earn attention. It simply removed the possibility of being noticed at all. In high school, it became clearer. Elena was the one they talked about. Her grades, her friends, her plans. "She is going to do something big," my father would say proudly to anyone who would listen, while I sat across the room finishing assignments, listening without interrupting. One afternoon I came home with a letter in my hand. Acceptance to a competitive summer program in business analytics. Something I had applied to without telling anyone. I found my parents in the kitchen, my mother chopping vegetables, my father reading something on his phone. "I got in," I said, holding out the letter. "Into the program I told you about." My mother glanced up briefly. "That is nice," she said, "but how far is it?" "It is about 200 miles, I answered. "They offer housing." My father lowered his phone slightly. 200 miles? He repeated. "That is not practical." "It is only for 8 weeks, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They said it could help with college applications." My mother shook her head. "We cannot just send you off like that, Camila. Your sister has her recital that summer. We need you here." I looked down at the letter, the words blurring slightly. "I can still come back for that," I said quietly. "It is important to her," my father added. Like that settled it. Like my opportunity was something flexible, something optional. "You understand," my mother said, placing a hand on my shoulder for a second before turning back to the cutting board. "You have always been the understanding one," and I nodded, because that was the role I knew how to play, the one who adjusted, the one who stepped back, the one who made things easier for everyone else. Later that night, I sat on my bed and reread the acceptance letter over and over, tracing the printed words with my finger like they might disappear if I did not. "You are really not going?" Elena asked from the doorway, leaning against the frame. "They wanted you, right?" "Yeah," I said, folding the paper carefully. "They did." "Why would you stay?" she asked. Not unkindly, just curious, and I shrugged. "It is just 8 weeks," I said, echoing what I had been told. "It is not that big of a deal." She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, and walked away. And that was the moment I realized something I did not have the words for back then. that if I kept shrinking myself to fit what everyone else needed, one day there would be nothing left of me that was mine. But I did not change. Not then. I stayed. I helped. I supported. I became exactly who they expected me to be. And years later, sitting at that dinner table with Daniel and his friends, hearing him say I was not remarkable enough, I recognized the feeling immediately. It was familiar, almost comfortable in a way that made it worse, because part of me had been trained to accept it, to nod, to stay quiet, to let it pass. But something else, something I had built slowly and silently over time, refused to settle this time. And as I sat there that night, listening to their laughter, I realized this was not just about my husband. It was about a pattern that started long before him, a pattern I had allowed for far too long. And for the first time, I was not sure I was willing to play my part anymore. I did not go to that summer program, but something about being chosen stayed with me, like a quiet signal I could not ignore. And when college applications came around, I applied to programs no one in my family had ever mentioned, schools outside our city, outside what they expected. I filled out forms late at night at the same kitchen table where I used to sit silently during dinner, the glow of my laptop reflecting off the surface while everyone else slept. And when the acceptance emails started coming in, I did not say anything at first. I just read them, one after another, letting the words settle. "We are pleased to offer you admission. We were impressed by your application." Phrases that felt unfamiliar, almost unreal. Until one afternoon my mother walked into my room and saw the screen. "What is this?" she asked, leaning closer. "You got into these?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah," I said. "I did." She frowned slightly. Not upset, just uncertain. "Why did you not tell us you were applying out of state?" "I did not think it mattered," I replied, and she looked at me for a second, longer than usual, like she was trying to understand something she had never paid attention to before. My father was quieter about it. He sat at the table that evening, flipping through the acceptance letters I printed, his expression unreadable. "These are good schools," he said finally. "Very competitive." I waited for something else, some kind of pride, but it did not come. Instead, he added, "But they are far," and I almost smiled at how predictable that was. "I know," I said. "That is the point." Elena reacted differently. She stood in my doorway again, arms crossed, the same way she had years before. "So you are just leaving?" she asked. "Like that?" "It is not like that," I said, folding clothes into a suitcase on my bed. "It is school." "You never wanted to leave before," she said, her voice sharper now. "You always stayed," I paused, a shirt in my hands. "Yeah," I said quietly, "I did." "So what changed?" she asked, and for a moment, I did not have an answer I could explain, not in a way that would make sense to her. "I think I did," I said finally, and she shook her head slightly, like she did not recognize me, like I was stepping outside of something she thought was fixed. College was the first place. I was not the background. The first place where being prepared, being observant, being consistent actually meant something. Professors called on me, classmates asked for my input, group projects did not happen around me, they happened with me. I studied business analytics, the same field I had almost explored years earlier, and I stayed late in the library. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because for the first time, effort felt like it was building towards something that belonged to me. During my second year, a professor pulled me aside after class. "Camila," he said, adjusting his glasses, "have you ever considered consulting?" I blinked. "Consulting? You have a way of seeing patterns other people miss," he continued. "Companies pay for that." I laughed softly, unsure if he was serious. "I do not think I am that person," I said, and he smiled, not dismissive, just certain. "You are," he replied. "You just have not decided to be yet." That conversation stayed with me longer than I expected, and a few months later, I applied for an internship with a small operations consulting firm. Nothing glamorous, just a team of 6 people working out of a shared office space above a coffee shop. But the first time I sat in a meeting and someone asked, "What do you think?" and actually waited for my answer, something shifted. I spoke carefully at first, then more confidently, pointing out inefficiencies, suggesting adjustments, watching as people nodded, wrote things down, implemented what I said. "Where did you learn that?" one of the senior consultants asked after a meeting, and I shrugged. "I just noticed," I said, and he smiled. That is exactly the skill. By the time I graduated, they offered me a full-time role, modest salary, long hours, but real work, meaningful work. I called home to tell my parents, standing outside my apartment, the city noise buzzing around me. "I got a job," I said when my mother answered. "In consulting." There was a pause on the other end. "That is good," she said. "Is it stable?" "It is," I replied, though I was not entirely sure yet. "Does it pay well?" My father asked when she passed him the phone. "It is a start," I said. "You always were practical," he responded, like it was both a compliment and a limitation. Elena texted me later that night. "Consulting sounds intense," she wrote. "Are you sure you want that?" I stared at the message for a moment before replying. "Yeah," I typed. "I think I do." The truth was, I did not just want it. I needed it. Because it was the first thing that felt like mine. The first thing that did not require me to step back so someone else could step forward. And over the next few years, that small firm became something bigger. We took on more clients, more complex problems, and I found myself solving things no one else could untangle. Quietly at first, then with more recognition, more responsibility, until one day, my manager called me into his office and closed the door behind me. "We have an opportunity," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "A major client, high stakes, but they specifically asked for you." I looked down at the folder, then back at him. "For me?" I asked, and he nodded. "They have heard about your work," he said. "They want you leading it." I felt that same stillness from years ago return, but this time it was different. Not quiet in the way of shrinking, but quiet in the way of something building, something ready. "Okay," I said, opening the folder, unaware that this was the moment everything would begin to change in ways none of us could predict. I took the project because saying no never really felt like an option. Not when someone finally saw me, not when they asked for me by name. The client was a mid-sized logistics company, struggling with operational losses. Nothing flashy, nothing public, but the numbers told a different story. Inefficiencies buried under years of small decisions no one questioned. "We have been bleeding for 18 months, the CEO said during our first meeting, his voice tight. "No one can figure out why." I sat across from him in a glass conference room, sunlight cutting across the table, my notebook open, pen still. "You have the data," I said. "You just have not looked at it the right way yet." He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That is why you are here." And for the first time, I felt the weight of expectation land on me in a way that did not feel like pressure. It felt like trust. I worked late nights in that office, long after the others had gone home, tracing patterns, mapping processes, watching where time and money slipped through unnoticed gaps, small things at first, duplicated routes, outdated vendor contracts, inefficient scheduling systems. But the deeper I looked, the more it expanded. "You are onto something," my manager said one evening, leaning over my shoulder as I walked him through a model I built. This could change everything for them. I nodded, but something about it felt bigger than that, like I was standing at the edge of something I had not fully understood yet. That is when Daniel started paying attention again, not to my work, but to my time. "You have been staying late a lot," he said one night, standing in the kitchen while I reheated leftovers. "It is just a project," I replied, setting the microwave timer. "Temporary." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You always say that," I glanced at him. "Because it usually is." "So what, this one is different?" he asked, and I hesitated for half a second, just enough for him to notice. "Maybe," I said, and something shifted in his expression, not curiosity, not pride, something closer to irritation. "Do not let it get to your head," he said lightly, like a joke, but it landed heavier than that. "It is still just consulting." I turned back to the microwave, watching the seconds count down. "Right," I said, because explaining it would not change anything. A week later, I came home earlier than usual, the office unexpectedly quiet after a system outage forced us to pause work for the night. The apartment was dark except for the glow from the living room. Daniel was on the couch, his laptop open, phone pressed between his shoulder and ear. "Yeah, I told you," he was saying, his voice low. "She is not that kind of person." I stopped in the hallway, just out of sight, something about his tone making me pause. "No, she works from home mostly," he continued. "Nothing major, just small clients, flexible stuff." I felt my hand tighten around my bag strap. Exactly, he said, a short laugh under his breath. It is not like she is building anything serious. There was a pause then. Trust me, I would know. The words settled into the space around me, quiet but sharp, and for a second I did not move. I just stood there, listening to the version of me he was offering to someone else, simplified, reduced, easier to dismiss. Yeah, he added. I just need to figure out how to, move forward. My chest tightened, not from shock, but from recognition. The same pattern, the same quiet dismissal dressed up as something reasonable, something harmless. I stepped into the room then, letting my keys hit the table a little louder than necessary. He looked up quickly, surprise flashing across his face before he smoothed it over. Hey, he said, ending the call. You are home early. Yeah, I replied, setting my bag down. System outage, he nodded, like that explained everything. Like the conversation I just heard had not happened. How was your day? He asked. And I studied him for a moment. The ease in his posture, the casual way he moved past it, like it was nothing productive, I said finally, because that was the truth. Even if it was not the whole truth, good, he replied, already turning back to his laptop. Just do not burn yourself out over something that is not going anywhere. I sat down across from him, the distance between us suddenly more defined than it had ever been. You do not think it is going anywhere? I asked, and he shrugged, not even looking up. I just think you should be realistic, he said. That is all. Realistic. The word echoed in my mind long after he went to bed, long after the apartment went quiet again. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table, the same place I had sat the night of that dinner, the same pale light filling the room, and pulled up the latest data model, the one I had not shown anyone yet, the one that connected everything, every inefficiency, every hidden cost, every pattern no one else had seen, and right there, buried under layers of transactions and routing logs, something none of us had expected, something that did not fit the narrative we had been working with, something that explained everything and at the same time threatened to unravel all of it. I stared at the screen, my pulse steady but heavier now, because this was not just about fixing a system anymore. This was about exposing something that had been carefully hidden, and the moment I realized what it meant, what it could do, what it would change, I understood that nothing about this project was small, nothing about it was temporary, and if I moved forward, if I followed it all the way through, there would be no going back, not for the company, not for the people involved, and not for me. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that when this came out, when the truth finally surfaced, it would not just change my work, it would collapse everything Daniel thought he knew about me in a single moment. I did not tell anyone what I found that night, not my manager, not the client, not even myself out loud. I just saved the file, closed the laptop, and sat there in the quiet like I was holding something fragile and dangerous at the same time, because the numbers did not just show inefficiency, they showed manipulation, patterns that could not be explained by mistakes or oversight, money moving in ways that suggested someone inside the company had been quietly redirecting resources for a long time. And the deeper I looked, the more precise it became, like a trail that had been carefully hidden but not carefully enough. The next morning, I walked into the office earlier than usual, the building still half empty, lights flickering on as I moved through the hallway. I went straight to my manager's office and knocked once before opening the door. You are here early, he said, looking up from his screen. I need to show you something, I replied. Setting my laptop down on his desk, he leaned forward as I walked him through the model, the flagged transactions, the timeline, the connections, his expression shifting slowly from interest to concern. Are you sure about this? He asked quietly. Yes, I said, my voice steady. It is consistent across multiple systems. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This is not just a process issue, he said, more to himself than to me. No, I replied, it is not. There was a long pause before he spoke again. We need to be careful, he said. If this is what it looks like, there are people who will not want this uncovered. I nodded, already aware of that, already feeling the weight of it settle in. What do you want to do? He asked. And I hesitated for the first time since I found it, because this was the point where everything shifted from analysis to action. We follow the data, I said finally, and he studied me for a moment before nodding. Okay, he said, but we do it quietly. That day changed the way everyone in the office looked at me. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small ways. Questions directed toward me, decisions paused until I spoke, a different kind of attention, one I had not fully experienced before, and somehow, word of the project started to spread beyond our small firm, not details, just that something significant was happening, something I was leading. And that is when the messages started. First from people I worked with, then from people I barely knew. Heard you are working on something big. One email read, would love to catch up. Another, if you ever want to explore other opportunities, let me know. I ignored most of them, focused on the work, on the evidence, on building a case that could not be dismissed. But at home, something else was unraveling. Daniel became more distant, more distracted. His phone always within reach, his tone sharper when he spoke to me, like every conversation was an inconvenience. You have been on your laptop every night, he said one evening, standing in the doorway while I reviewed documents. It is work? I replied without looking up. It is always work, he snapped, and I paused then, glancing at him. What do you want me to say? I asked, and he shook his head, frustrated. I want you to be present, he said. I want you to care about this. He gestured vaguely around the apartment, like this meant everything except what I was actually doing. I am here, I said, closing the laptop slowly. No, you are not, he replied, his voice quieter now but more pointed. You are somewhere else, and I do not even know where that is. I held his gaze for a moment, then looked away, because the truth was, he had never really known, not because I hid it, but because he never asked. The next day, my phone buzzed during a meeting. I glanced down at the screen and saw his name, then another call, and another, 5 missed calls. In less than 10 minutes, I excused myself and stepped into the hallway, calling him back. What is going on? I asked when he answered, his voice rushed, almost breathless. Why is my friend sending me articles with your name on them? He demanded. And my chest tightened slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that something had already started to leak. What articles? I asked. Though I already had an idea. Do not do that, he snapped. Do not act like you do not know. It says you are leading some major project, some investigation. Camila, what is this? I leaned against the wall, the cool surface grounding me. It is work, I said again. That is all. That is not all, he insisted. Why would they send it to me? Why would they think I would not know? There was something else in his voice now, something unsettled, something that did not fit his usual confidence. I do not know, I replied, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching longer than it should have. Why did you not tell me? He asked finally, and the question hung there, heavier than anything else he had said, because the answer was simple and complicated at the same time. You never asked, I said quietly, and I could hear the shift on the other end of the line, the way that landed, the way it did not fit into the version of things he had built in his mind. That is not fair, he said, but his voice lacked conviction now. Is it not? I replied, and he did not answer. That night, the messages kept coming. Texts from him, missed calls, a long email that arrived just after midnight, subject line empty, just my name in the body, followed by paragraphs I had never seen from him before, explanations, excuses, attempts to soften what he had said. I did not mean it like that. They were just joking. You know how they are. I have always supported you. I read every word without responding, not because I wanted to punish him, but because none of it changed anything. Not the dinner, not the phone call I overheard, not the way he had chosen to describe me when I was not in the room. The next morning there was a handwritten note on the kitchen counter, his handwriting uneven, rushed. Can we talk? It said, just 3 words, and for a moment I stood there looking at it, feeling nothing, not anger, not sadness, just a quiet distance that I did not know how to close. My phone buzzed again, another message from him. Please, it read, and I set it face down on the counter, because the truth was, there was nothing left to say that would bring us back to where we were, and as the day went on, as the calls continued, as the messages stacked up one after another, each one more urgent than the last, I realized something I had not expected, not relief, not satisfaction, just a kind of stillness, like I had stepped outside of something that used to define me, and now, standing there in that quiet space, I understood that whatever came next, I would be facing it alone, not because I had no one, but because the version of me that had stayed, that had explained, that had tried to make things work, was no longer there. The apartment felt different after that, not empty in the way it used to when Daniel worked late, but hollow in a quieter, more permanent way, like something essential had been removed without making a sound. His messages slowed after a few days, then stopped altogether. Not because things were resolved, but because he had run out of words that could reach me, and I had run out of reasons to respond. I would come home, set my keys on the same spot by the door, walk past the couch where he used to sit scrolling through his phone, and go straight to the kitchen table, the same table where everything had started to shift, my laptop open, files spread out, numbers that demanded my attention even when everything else felt distant. "You are still here this late?" My manager asked one evening when he found me in the office, long after everyone else had left, his voice softer than usual. "Yeah," I said without looking up. "Just finishing something." He stepped closer, glancing at the screen, then back at me. "You do not have to carry all of this alone," he said, and I paused then, my fingers resting on the keyboard. "I know," I replied, but the truth was, I did not know how not to, because carrying things quietly was the only way I had ever learned to exist. A few days later, my phone rang with a number I had not seen in a while. I almost did not answer, but something made me pick up. "Camila?" My mother's voice came through, hesitant. "I heard something about your work." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. "Yeah," I said, "it has been busy." There was a pause, the kind that used to make me fill the silence, explain, soften, but this time I did not. "You should have told us," she said finally, and I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh. "About what?" I asked. "About what you have been doing," she replied. "Your father saw something online, your name, it looked important." I closed my eyes briefly. "It is just a project," I said, the same words I had used before, the same words that had kept everything simple, manageable. "It does not sound like just a project," she said, and there was something unfamiliar in her tone, something like uncertainty, like she was realizing there were parts of me she had never taken the time to understand. "Maybe it is not," I admitted quietly, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "You always kept things to yourself," she said, almost to herself. "It was easier that way," I replied, and the conversation ended soon after, not with tension, not with resolution, just a quiet acknowledgement of distance that had been there long before this. That night, I sat in the apartment with the lights off, the city outside moving like it always did, cars passing, distant voices, the kind of background noise that reminded you the world kept going, whether you felt part of it or not. I thought about the years I had spent adjusting, stepping back, making space, not just for Daniel, but for everyone, and how easily that version of me had been dismissed, reduced to something convenient, something temporary. My phone buzzed again, a message from an unknown number this time. I opened it slowly. "We need to talk," it read, followed by a name I recognized from the client's executive team. My chest tightened slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what that meant. The data, the patterns, the evidence I had been building. It was no longer contained. It was starting to reach the people it would affect the most. I typed a short reply, "When?" and set the phone down, my reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. I barely recognized the stillness in my own face, not empty, not broken, just quiet, like everything loud had already passed through and left something more solid behind. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror in that same small bathroom, the flickering light still uneven, and for a second I saw myself the way I used to, someone careful, someone who measured every word, every reaction. But then it shifted, just slightly, not dramatic, not sudden, just enough to notice. "You are different," my manager said later that day, watching me as I walked into the meeting room, and I stopped at the doorway, meeting his eyes. "Am I?" I asked, and he nodded slowly. "You are not hesitating anymore," he said, and I thought about that, about the way I used to pause, to second guess, to soften, and how that instinct had faded somewhere along the way. "Maybe I just ran out of reasons to," I replied, and as I took my seat, opening my laptop, the room filling with people who had no idea how much was about to change, I realized something I had not fully allowed myself to feel before. Not hope exactly, but something close to it, something steady, something that suggested this was not the end of something lost, but the beginning of something I had finally chosen for myself. The meeting started at 9 sharp, the kind of meeting where everyone arrived early but no one spoke until the right person did. I walked in with my laptop already open, documents queued, numbers organized in a way that told a story without needing explanation. The room filled slowly, executives taking their seats, quiet conversations cutting off as the door closed, and when the CEO looked at me and said, "You wanted to present something?" I did not hesitate. "Yes," I replied, standing up, connecting my screen, the first slide simple, clean, no dramatic titles, just data. "I found something that explains the losses," I said, my voice steady, and as I walked them through the model, the patterns, the transactions that did not align, I watched their expressions shift one by one, confusion, then concern, then something sharper. "This cannot be right," one of them said, leaning forward. "It is," I replied calmly. "It is consistent across every system." Another voice cut in. "Are you suggesting internal manipulation?" And I paused for a fraction of a second, not because I was unsure, but because I understood what that question meant. "I am suggesting the data points to something intentional," I said, and the room went quiet. Not dramatic, not loud, just a silence that settled in as everyone processed what that implied. After the meeting, my manager walked beside me in the hallway, slower than usual. "You handled that well," he said, glancing at me. "You did not hold back." "There was nothing to hold back," I replied, and he nodded, like he had expected that answer, like he had been waiting for me to reach this point. Work became clearer after that. Not easier, but more defined. There was no more hesitation in what needed to be done. Reports were compiled, evidence organized, conversations shifted from speculation to action, and I moved through it all without the pauses that used to slow me down. At night, the apartment stayed quiet, no messages, no missed calls, just space, and I filled it differently now, not with waiting, but with movement. I rearranged things, small changes at first, moving the table closer to the window, clearing out drawers that held things I no longer needed, folding clothes I had not worn in years into boxes. One evening, as I stood in the doorway holding a stack of old papers, I realized how much of my life had been built around accommodating someone else, adjusting, aligning, leaving space where I thought it was required, and how little of it had actually been chosen by me. My phone rang again a few days later, this time from a number I recognized immediately. "Elena?" I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hey," I said, my voice neutral. "Hey," she replied, her tone softer than I expected. "I saw something about you online." I exhaled quietly. "Yeah," I said. "It has been busy." There was a pause then. "Why did you not tell me?" she asked, and I leaned back against the wall, looking out the window at the city lights. "I did not think it mattered," I said, echoing something from years ago without meaning to. She was quiet for a second. Then, "It matters," she said, more firmly this time. "You matter." And something about that landed differently now, not because it fixed anything, but because it came too late to change what had already shaped me. "I'm okay," I said, and I meant it in a way I had never said it before. Not as reassurance for someone else, but as a statement of fact. "Are you?" she asked, and I considered the question carefully. "Yeah," I said finally. "I think I am." After we hung up, I went back to the table, opened my laptop, and continued working. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because this was where I was building something that did not depend on anyone else's approval. Days turned into weeks, the project expanded, more people brought in, more attention, more weight, but I moved through it all the same way. Steady, deliberate, without the need to explain myself. One afternoon, my manager stepped into my office, a slight smile on his face. "You might want to see this," he said, handing me his phone. I looked down at the screen, an article, my name mentioned again, but this time not just in passing, this time with recognition, with context, with a clear acknowledgement of what I had done. I handed the phone back, my expression unchanged. "This is just the beginning," he said, watching me closely, and I met his gaze, a small nod replacing any need for words, because he was right. This was not the peak, not the conclusion, just the point where everything that had been built quietly started to become visible, and for the first time, I was not standing in the background of that visibility. I was at the center of it, not because I had pushed my way there, but because I had finally stopped stepping aside, and somewhere ahead, just beyond what I could fully see yet, I knew there was something bigger waiting, something that would not just change how others saw me, but confirm everything I had already begun to understand about myself. By the time the second report went out, my name was no longer just circulating inside the company. It was attached to decisions, to outcomes, to a direction people were starting to follow without questioning, and I could feel the shift not in anything loud or dramatic, but in the way rooms changed when I walked in. Conversations paused, then resumed with intention. "Camila, can you take a look at this before we finalize?" Someone would ask, sliding documents across the table without hesitation, and I would, not rushing, not over-explaining, just reading, adjusting, refining. "Change this structure," I said during one meeting, tapping a section of the report. "It hides the actual issue." The executive across from me nodded immediately. "Do it," he replied. "No pushback, no second guessing, just trust, the kind I used to wait for and now did not need to ask for." A few weeks later, the company formalized my role on the project. A temporary title, but one that carried weight. Lead operations consultant, printed clearly on the badge they handed me, the plastic still stiff when I clipped it onto my blazer. I glanced down at it for a moment longer than necessary, not because of the title itself, but because of what it represented. A name, a role, a position that no one could casually dismiss or redefine. "Looks official," my manager said with a small smile as we walked into another strategy session. "It is just a label," I replied, though we both knew it was more than that. Labels changed how people listened, how they responded, how they positioned themselves around you. That afternoon, I stood at the front of a larger conference room, a screen behind me displaying the finalized analysis, rows of executives and stakeholders seated in front of me, the room quieter than usual, expectant. "We have identified the source of the losses," I said, my voice even, measured, "and we have a plan to correct it." I walked them through the structure, the corrections, the controls that would prevent it from happening again, and when I finished, there was a pause, not uncertainty, but processing. Then the CEO leaned forward slightly. "How long until we stabilize?" he asked, and I met his gaze without hesitation. 90 days, I said, "if we implement everything as outlined." He nodded slowly, then looked around the room. "Then we move forward," he said, just like that. No debate, no delay. The meeting ended with decisions, real ones, not the kind that get revisited later, but the kind that set things in motion. As people filed out, a few stopped to speak with me directly, asking follow-up questions, clarifying details, not out of doubt, but out of alignment. And for the first time, I noticed something subtle but undeniable. No one was looking past me to someone else for confirmation. Later that evening, I walked out of the building with my badge still clipped to my blazer, the weight of it barely noticeable physically, but present in a way I could not ignore. I passed by the glass doors and caught my reflection for a second. The same person, the same face, but not the same presence. Not the same posture. Not the same quiet habit of stepping back. My phone buzzed as I reached the sidewalk. A message from an unknown number again. But this time I recognized it immediately. Daniel. I had not seen his name in days, maybe weeks. And for a moment, I just stared at it, the screen lighting up in my hand. "Can we talk?" It read, the same words as before, but without the urgency, without the repetition, just a simple question. I did not open it right away. I slipped the phone back into my bag and started walking, the evening air cooler now, the city moving around me in a steady rhythm. I passed a storefront window and caught my reflection again, the badge still visible, the title clear, and I thought about the way he used to describe me, the words he chose when he thought I was not listening, flexible, small, not remarkable, and how none of that aligned with the person standing here now, not because I had changed suddenly, but because I had stopped hiding what was already there. When I got home, the apartment felt the same as it had for weeks, quiet, still, but it no longer felt like something missing, it felt like space. I set my bag down, removed the badge, placed it carefully on the table, and finally took my phone out again, reading his message once more. "Can we talk?" I sat down, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light, and for a moment, I considered all the versions of this conversation that could follow, explanations, apologies, attempts to reconnect something that had already shifted beyond recognition. But then I set the phone face down without responding. Not out of anger, not out of avoidance, just clarity. Because whatever he thought we needed to talk about, whatever version of me he was trying to reach, it no longer existed in the way he understood. And as I leaned back in my chair, the events of the past few weeks settling into something more defined, I realized that everything that had happened, the dinner, the silence, the distance, the work, it had all led back to this moment. Not a confrontation, not a dramatic resolution, but a quiet understanding of where I stood and where I was going next. And somewhere in the background of that stillness, I could feel the present catching up, the point where past and now would finally meet again. The email came through at 6:12 a.m. Subject line simple, direct, executive review meeting, mandatory attendance, and I knew immediately what it was about, not because of the wording, but because of the timing, the kind of meeting that only happens when something has already gone too far to contain quietly. I arrived at the building earlier than usual, the lobby quieter, the air sharper in that way it gets before something significant shifts. My badge still clipped neatly to my blazer, the title catching the light every time I moved, lead operations consultant. I pressed the elevator button and watched the numbers climb slowly. My reflection faint in the brushed metal doors, calm, steady, the same stillness that had carried me through everything up to this point. When the doors opened, the hallway outside the executive conference room was already filled with people, some standing, some seated, conversations low, controlled, but there was something underneath it, tension. Not loud, not chaotic, just present. "Camila," my manager said as soon as he saw me, stepping closer, his voice quieter than usual. "They pulled in legal." I nodded once, not surprised. "That makes sense," I replied. He studied me for a moment, like he was expecting something more, some sign of hesitation. But when it did not come, he gave a small nod and stepped aside, letting me pass. Inside the room, the atmosphere shifted slightly as I entered. Not dramatically, just enough to notice, eyes turning briefly, then back to their screens, their notes, their conversations. I took my seat at the end of the table, placing my laptop in front of me, opening it without rushing, without drawing attention. Across the table, I recognized several faces from previous meetings, but there were new ones now. Legal counsel, external advisors, people who were not there to speculate, but to confirm. "We will begin in a moment," the CEO said, his voice carrying just enough to quiet the room. I glanced down at my phone for a second, a habit more than anything else, and there it was again, another message from Daniel sent just minutes earlier. "I am outside," it read, and for a brief moment, something shifted in my chest. Not panic, not even surprise, just awareness, the past and present moving closer to the same point. I set the phone face down on the table, my focus returning to the room, the conversation starting around me, details being confirmed, timelines reviewed. But underneath it all, there was a shared understanding that this meeting was not about discussion, it was about disclosure. "Camila," one of the legal advisors said, turning slightly in my direction, "you have been leading the analysis, correct?" I met his gaze. "Yes," I replied. "Then we will need you to walk us through the findings," he said, his tone neutral, procedural. I nodded once. "Of course." The CEO leaned forward, hands folded on the table. "Before we proceed," he said, "I want to be clear about the purpose of this meeting." His eyes moved around the room, settling briefly on each person. "We are here to understand exactly what has happened, how it happened, and what actions need to be taken moving forward." No one responded, but the silence that followed was heavier now, more focused. I could feel it building, not in a way that rushed me, but in a way that clarified everything. My laptop screen glowed softly in front of me, the files already open, the data organized in a sequence that would lead them step by step to the conclusion I had reached days ago. I adjusted the position slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table, a small movement, precise, controlled. "Are you ready?" my manager asked quietly beside me, and I glanced at him for a second, seeing something in his expression that had not been there before, respect, but also something like anticipation. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. Just as the door at the far end of the room opened, a slight movement that drew attention without sound. I did not turn immediately, but I felt it, the shift in the room, the subtle change in focus, And when I finally did look, just briefly, I saw him standing there, just inside the doorway. Daniel, his posture uncertain, his presence out of place in a room like this, his eyes scanning until they found me, and for the first time since everything began, the distance between who he thought I was and who I had become was visible, not in anything I said, but in where I was sitting, what I was about to do. The room settled again, the door closing behind him, and the CEO's voice cut through the silence. "Let us begin." And I placed my hand on the laptop, ready to open the first file, knowing that once I did, there would be no more questions about who I was or what I had built, only the truth that had been waiting to be seen. I clicked the first file open, and the screen shifted from idle light to structured data, rows and columns that looked ordinary to anyone who did not know what they were seeing, but every number had already been verified, cross-checked, aligned with patterns that could not be explained away. "This is a summary of the last 18 months, I said, my voice even, not raised, not rushed, just clear. What you are looking at are operational discrepancies that were initially categorized as inefficiencies." I moved to the next slide, highlighting sections without over-explaining, letting the structure speak first. However, when mapped across departments, the pattern changes. One of the executives leaned forward slightly. "Changes how?" he asked. And I met his gaze without hesitation. "It becomes consistent," I replied. "Not random, not isolated, consistent." There was a pause, a shift in posture around the table, attention narrowing. "Consistent with what?" Another voice asked, sharper now, and I did not look away. "Intentional redirection," I said, and the words landed quietly but firmly. No one interrupted. No one reacted immediately, but I could feel the weight of it settle in. I moved to the next file, opening the transaction logs. Timestamps aligned in a sequence that told the same story from a different angle. "These entries were flagged because they bypass standard approval protocols," I continued. "At first glance, they appear minor, but when aggregated, they account for a significant portion of the loss." The legal advisor to my left shifted in his seat. "Are you saying this was authorized?" he asked, his tone measured. I shook my head slightly. "I am saying it was allowed," I replied, and that distinction seemed to land deeper than anything else. Across the table, the CEO exhaled slowly, his hands still folded. "Who had access to override these controls?" he asked. And I paused just long enough to pull up the final document, the one that connected every point, every system, every exception. "Access was limited," I said, turning the screen slightly so the table could see. "To a small group within senior operations, names appeared on the screen. Not highlighted, not emphasized, just present, undeniable." There was no reaction at first, just silence, the kind that stretches because no one wants to be the first to acknowledge what they are seeing. "This cannot be accurate," someone said finally, their voice lower now, almost uncertain. "It is," I replied calmly. "Every data point has been verified independently." I did not raise my voice, did not defend it, just stated it because the work spoke for itself. I could feel Daniel's presence in the room without looking directly at him, the way the air shifted slightly, the way his stillness did not match the others, but I did not turn, not yet. "What happens next?" the CEO asked, his voice quieter now, more controlled. I closed the file slowly, the screen returning to a neutral display. "That depends on how you choose to proceed," I said. "The data outlines the issue clearly. The corrective actions are already included in the report." I slid a printed copy across the table. The pages aligned neatly. No dramatic gestures, just completion. The legal advisor reached for it first, flipping through the pages quickly, then more slowly, as if confirming what he had already seen on the screen. "This is thorough," he said, almost to himself. I nodded once. "It needed to be," I replied. There was another pause, heavier this time, not confusion, but realization, the kind that settles in stages, piece by piece, until it cannot be ignored. "Camila," the CEO said after a moment, his eyes on me now in a way that felt different than before. Not just recognition, but something closer to respect. "You led this entire analysis?" I held his gaze. "Yes," I said simply. No explanation, no qualifiers, just the truth. He nodded slowly, then looked around the room. "Then we move forward based on this," he said, his voice firmer now. "Decisions forming in real time, people shifting, preparing for action. But beneath it all, there was still that silence, that undercurrent of something unresolved." I finally turned my head slightly, just enough to see him. Daniel standing near the back of the room, his posture no longer confident, his expression fixed somewhere between disbelief and something deeper, something that looked like he was trying to reconcile two versions of the same person and failing. Our eyes met for a brief second, and I did not look away. I did not soften it. I did not fill the space with anything unnecessary. I just held it, steady, the same way I had held everything else. And in that moment, there was no need for explanation, no need for defense, because everything he had said, everything he had believed, everything he had repeated to others without question, was now sitting in front of him in a way that could not be dismissed, not by him, not by anyone in that room. The silence stretched just long enough to become something else, something final. And I realized then that this was not the moment I had imagined before, not a confrontation, not a reaction, just a quiet shift where the truth existed on its own, undeniable. And as the room moved forward, voices rising again, decisions being made, I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction, not relief, just clarity, the kind that does not need to be spoken. And behind me, I could hear the faint sound of a chair moving, a breath held too long finally released. And I knew without turning that for him, this was the moment everything broke in a way he had not prepared for. The room did not erupt after the meeting ended. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, just movement, controlled, deliberate, people gathering documents, speaking in low tones, legal stepping aside with executives, decisions already unfolding beyond what was visible. And I closed my laptop slowly, aligning the edges of the papers in front of me before standing up, not rushing, not lingering, just moving forward the same way I had throughout the entire process. As I stepped out into the hallway, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just settled, like something that had been uncertain was now defined. "Camila," my manager called from behind me, catching up in a few quick steps. That was exactly what needed to happen. I nodded once. "It was time," I said, and he studied me for a moment, like he was expecting something more, some reaction that never came. "You should take the rest of the day," he added. Softer now. "You have done enough." I considered it briefly, then shook my head. "I will finish the follow-ups," I replied, because stopping now did not feel like rest. It felt like interruption, and I was not ready to interrupt this version of myself. He nodded again, not pushing, just understanding. As he walked away, I turned toward the elevator, pressing the button and watching the numbers descend, the reflection in the metal doors steady, unchanged. When they opened, I stepped inside alone, the quiet of the space wrapping around me as the doors closed. And for the first time that day, I allowed myself a small exhale. Not relief, not release, just acknowledgement. When the doors opened again on the ground floor, he was there, exactly where he said he would be, standing near the glass entrance, hands at his sides, posture uncertain in a way I had never seen before. "Daniel," he looked up as soon as I stepped out, like he had been waiting for that exact moment. "Camila," he said, his voice lower than usual, almost careful. I stopped a few feet away, not close enough for familiarity, not far enough for avoidance, just enough distance to make the space between us clear. "You should not be here," I said, not harsh, just direct. He nodded quickly. "I know, I needed to talk to you." His words came out slower than before, like he was measuring them, trying to find something that would land. "I saw everything," he added, and I held his gaze, not asking what he meant, because it was obvious. "Okay," I replied, and the simplicity of that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else. "That is all you are going to say?" he asked, a faint edge of frustration slipping through. I tilted my head slightly. "What are you expecting?" I asked, and he hesitated, his hands shifting slightly, like he did not know where to place them. "I do not know," he admitted. I did not know you were this." The word hung there, incomplete, and I let it sit for a moment before responding. "You did not ask," I said, my tone even. The same words from before, but now they carried a different weight, he exhaled. looking down briefly before meeting my eyes again. "That is not fair," he said, but his voice lacked the certainty it used to have. I shook my head slightly. "It is accurate," I replied, and that seemed to land deeper than any argument would have. He stepped a little closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to shift the balance. "I made a mistake," he said, the words quiet, almost careful. "I said things I did not mean." I watched him for a second, not reacting immediately, letting the silence stretch just enough. "You meant them when you said them," I replied, not accusatory, just factual. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, like he was searching for a way around that. "I was under pressure," he added, and I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it was familiar, the same kind of explanation that used to make me adjust, soften, understand. "We all were," I said, and that was all. No further elaboration. No room to shift the focus away from what had actually happened. He looked at me then, really looked, like he was trying to find something that had been there before, something he could recognize. "You have changed," he said, and I considered that for a moment. "No," I replied quietly. I stopped pretending, and that seemed to hit him harder than anything else, because it removed the idea that this was sudden, that it was new. It made it clear that what he was seeing now had always been there, just not visible to him. The silence between us settled again, not uncomfortable, just complete. "Can we fix this?" he asked finally, the question coming out softer, more uncertain than anything he had said before, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not resentment, just clarity. The kind that does not leave room for negotiation. "There is nothing to fix," I said, my voice steady, and he flinched slightly, not visibly, but enough to notice. "So that is it?" he asked, and I nodded once. "That is it," I replied. No hesitation, no added explanation, just the boundary set exactly where it needed to be. He stood there for a second longer, like he was waiting for something to change, for me to soften, to step back into a role that no longer existed. But when it did not happen, when the space between us remained exactly the same, he finally looked away, a small shift in his posture, like something inside him had adjusted to match the reality in front of him. "I did not see you," he said quietly, almost to himself, and I let that sit there, because it was the closest thing to truth he had said. "No," I replied, "you did not." And with that, I stepped past him, not rushing, not looking back, just moving forward. The glass doors opening as I approached, the city outside waiting in the same steady rhythm it always had, and as I walked out, I realized something that had not fully settled until now. This was not closure, not in the way people describe it, not a clean ending tied together with understanding and resolution. It was something quieter, something unfinished in a way that did not need to be completed, because the part that mattered, the part that belonged to me, was already decided, and whatever remained between us, whatever questions or emotions had not fully resolved, they no longer defined where I was going next. The days that followed did not feel like an ending. They felt like space, the kind that stretches quietly into your life without asking permission, and at first I did not know what to do with it. I woke up earlier than I needed to, not out of pressure, but because my mind no longer carried the weight of waiting for someone else's mood, someone else's approval. The apartment was still the same light falling across the kitchen table in the morning, the same hum of the refrigerator, but it no longer felt like a place I had to fit into. It felt like somewhere I had chosen. Work continued, steady and demanding, but now it was aligned, not just with what I could do, but with who I had decided to be. The project reached its conclusion within the 90-day timeline. Systems corrected, structures rebuilt, accountability established, and when the final report was delivered, there was no applause, no dramatic acknowledgement, just a quiet moment where the CEO shook my hand and said, "You changed the direction of this company." And I nodded, not because I needed to accept the praise, but because I understood the weight of what had been done, not just for them, but for me. I moved into a smaller place a few weeks later, not out of necessity but intention. A one-bedroom apartment with large windows facing west, the kind of light that settles softly at the end of the day. I unpacked slowly, placing things where they made sense to me, not where they would look right to someone else. There was no rush, no pressure to fill every corner. I left space where I wanted space, and that became its own kind of peace. My phone became quieter over time, fewer messages, fewer calls, not because people disappeared, but because I no longer held space for conversations that pulled me backward. My mother called again one afternoon, her voice softer, more measured than before. "You sound different," she said, and I smiled slightly, standing by the window, watching the city move below. "I am," I replied, and for once, she did not question it. Elena sent a message a few days later, a simple one. "I am proud of you," and I read it twice before responding, not because I needed it, but because I understood what it meant for her to say it. Daniel did not call again, not after that last conversation, and I did not expect him to. Some distances, once created, are not meant to be crossed again, and that is not loss, that is alignment. The truth is, nothing in my life became perfect after everything that happened. There were still long nights, still moments of doubt, still quiet spaces that felt unfamiliar, but they were mine, and that made all the difference. Because I was no longer shaping myself to fit into someone else's idea of what I should be. I was building something that reflected who I actually was, and that process is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is quiet, consistent, sometimes uncomfortable, but always real. If there is one thing I learned from all of this, it is that people do not always see you clearly, sometimes because they cannot, sometimes because they choose not to. And if you wait for that recognition before you step into your own value, you may be waiting forever. Your worth is not something that needs to be announced, defended, or proven to the wrong people. It is something you have to recognize first and protect, not with anger, not with walls, but with boundaries that do not shift just because someone else is uncomfortable with them. If you are listening to this and you feel like you have been made smaller, quieter, less than what you know you are, I want you to understand something. That feeling is not your weakness, it is your awareness. It is the part of you that knows there is more. Even when everything around you tries to define you differently, trust that, even when it is quiet, even when it does not make sense yet, because that is where change begins, not in loud moments, but in the quiet decision to stop shrinking, to stop explaining, to stop asking for permission to exist as you are. Protect your time, protect your energy, protect your financial independence, because those are not just practical choices, they are forms of self-respect that no one else can give you. I believe that sometimes God, or the universe, or whatever you hold faith in, places us in situations that feel uncomfortable not to break us, but to reveal us, to show us the parts of ourselves we have been ignoring, the strength we have been underestimating, and the truth we have been avoiding. I am not grateful for the pain, but I am grateful for what it showed me, because without it, I might have stayed in a version of my life that was easier, but not honest. My name is Camila Reyes. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I want to leave you with is simple. Never let someone else's limited view of you become the limit you place on yourself. Thank you for being here, for listening, for allowing this story to exist beyond just me. Because if it reached you, if it made you pause even for a moment, then it means you are not alone in whatever you are carrying. And that matters more than anything. If you feel comfortable, share where you are listening from. Share what part of this story stayed with you. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that remind us who we are when everything else tries to define us, stay with this space. There are more waiting for you, more stories, more moments, more truths that might sound familiar in ways you did not expect. And maybe, just maybe, one of them will be exactly what you need to hear next.